No Longer a Skeptic by Crashdown Zero. When I was a child, I lived with my grandparents on and off. Family members had always talked about how my grandparents' home was haunted, but no one ever looked into the history of the house. Over the years, I've heard stories about my grandfather getting up in the middle of the night to get a glass of water and walking past people sitting on the stairs. Apparently, whenever this happened, he would bring his water back to his room and go back to sleep, only to find the full glass sitting on the steps in the morning. My grandmother would tell stories about how she would have coffee with her mother every morning in the kitchen. Of course, that wasn't possible. My great-grandmother had died decades ago in their country home. There were always stories about people being touched and pushed by unseen forces, and over the years this all became so normal to them. Obviously, since my grandfather never freaked out about the people on the stairs in the night. The upstairs of the house, though, was the worst part. People who went upstairs always mentioned how they felt like they were being watched. My aunt, who would visit with her family every few years, spoke about how one night she and her husband were fooling around in one of the upstairs bedrooms while her kids slept in the next room. The door was locked since her kids were young, and she figured that walking in on Mommy and Daddy getting frisky would be traumatic. And while carrying on, they could hear the doorknob jiggling, and they listened but didn't check on it right away. Whoever was at the door was really trying to get in. After a few minutes, it stopped. My aunt and her husband felt bad, assuming that it was one of the kids that got out of bed to check. The problem was, the kids were all asleep. All of them. My grandparents, too. There was no one else in the house that would have been at the door. Multiple times my mother mentioned feeling like she was being held down in her bed, but I always chalked that up to sleep paralysis. The reason I'm telling this story is because I used to be a skeptic. I say used to be. I had never believed in the supernatural, and I had been in the house millions of times. I had never experienced anything there, at least not until one night when I was 12. My mom, my brother, and I were living with my grandparents. My mom was engaged, and that particular night was actually the night of her wedding rehearsal. It was also Halloween. I was being a cranky kid, so they decided to bring me home, and my stepdad brought me back and assured me that my grandparents would be home soon. They had gone to pick up my aunt from the airport, and I had been left home alone plenty of times. I was laying on my bed watching TV in the dark. All the other lights on in the house were off except for a nightlight out in the hall outside my door. No one was afraid of the dark, we just weren't really fans of falling down the stairs. Anyway, in my room out of the corner of my eye, I could see someone standing in the doorway. I looked over at the door, and I could see the dark silhouette of someone standing in the door. And the problem was that that was all I could see. Just a dark shape of a person. Even in the dark, I should have been able to make out some features. And the light from the TV should have been enough to see something. But there was nothing, just that shadow. While staring straight at it, I reached out and turned on the lamp on my nightstand. The light came on, illuminating the room, and there was no one there. Without looking away, I turned the light back off. There was no one there. The strangest thing about the whole situation was that I had never seen or heard anything else in that house. Yeah, I always felt weird there, like I was being watched. My grandmother still lives there. My grandfather passed away a few years ago, and there have been news stories about someone holding my grandmother's hand at night or jumping on her bed. But as I said, I haven't experienced anything else. However, every time I go there, I still feel like I'm being watched. And I still don't go upstairs. More Than She Said, submitted by Gregonator. This happened in the summer of 1988. The names have been changed, etc., etc. I was 17 at the time and working at a local grocery store to make some money, as I was planning on going to college after I graduated. I had a car, but was so cheap at the time, I rarely drove it to save on gas. I wanted to have extra cash at school and live like the life I saw in the movies. Yeah, that was a bunch of bullshit and not how college life really is, but that's another story. So my family was having a party that night for the people who lived around us and our extended family, too. We lived in the country in Kansas, and the closest town was about 3 miles away. I rode my bike back and forth there all year long after school and practice and on weekends to work, and this weekend was no exception. I was excited to see some of my cousins and my friends, so I was pedaling hard home from work, and I popped a tire. Like the moron that I was, I didn't have a pump and patch kit with me, so I had no other choice but to hoof it the rest of the way, pushing my bike. Not long after, a pickup truck pulled up, and a woman in her 20s shouted out if I needed a ride. I said yeah, and she said put the bike in the bed of the truck. This was the 80s, guys, and out in the middle of nowhere, we didn't think about stranger danger and all that stuff. I hopped in the truck and said thanks, and the woman said no problem, where are you headed? I told her I was just going up the road, and she said, you got a name? I told her it was Greg, and she said her name was Shayna. I thought that was an odd name. I didn't know anyone with a name like that. She didn't look like she was from around there either. She wore skin-tight jeans and a tight top, where most of the girls at this time around me were into baggier jeans and looser shirts. Shayna looked like she was from the city. She drove to my house, and when she pulled down the long driveway up to it, my mom and aunt came out to see who the stranger in the truck was. Our closest neighbors were about 1.5 miles away, and we all kind of knew who drove what and that sort of thing. Just typical country folk. I jumped out and got my bike, and before I could thank her, my mom was in her cab window saying hi and looking over at me. Over my shoulder I said, "This is Shayna, Mom. She gave me a ride home. My bike's got a flat." My mom and aunt broke into smiles and thanked her for being so kind, and then asked her where she was from. Shayna said she was just driving through and got lost and was on her way to see her grandparents that lived in a town about 20 miles from ours. "Oh, well," said my mom, "why don't you stick around and join us for some food before you head back out? We're having a grand party today, and you can't say no." My mom is great, and I love her, but I always thought that was so lame, calling things grand all the time. Grand party, grand reunion, grand everything she did. Shayna hesitated for a minute, but then said, sure, why not? She pulled her truck around in our drive, and I ran in to get cleaned up, and the party was in about an hour, and people were just starting to arrive. When I came back out, Shayna was helping my aunt with stuff, and my cousins had just arrived, so I wasn't paying too much attention to her, and she kind of began to blend in. About 40 people showed up, and while some of us were playing games and Shayna was milling around the adults, she finally saw me and came over. We talked for a while, but she was just really quiet about where she was from and kept everything really vague, like she was from out of state and didn't talk about her family, except her grandparents. My cousin Luke asked her about them, and she repeated the same story she told my parents, and he pressed her on some names, and I think she gave a really generic name like Jones or Smith. That part's kind of fuzzy in my recollections. Luke gave her a look, but didn't say anything, and then he shot me a look, and again, didn't say anything. After a bit, we went to get food, and my uncle, who I need to say is a cop, said hi to us as we sat eating chicken and corn on the cob. He asked Shayna more questions, and again she was really evasive, and I could tell my uncle wasn't buying any word of what she said. I was starting to wonder why everyone was so interested in this normal girl who just gave me a ride home. We ate, and Shayna said she had to go, but needed to use the bathroom, and could I show it to her. I let her into the house, and then went to my room to get something I had borrowed from another cousin, and Shayna came into my room while I was rooting around for it, and she said she had to get going. "You're a cute kid, you know that?" she said, and I probably blushed. I walked her to the door and thanked her again, and she thanked me. She got into her truck, but not before kissing me and saying, "See you around." I watched her drive off and then went back to the party. My uncle caught me before I got into a game of football and asked me more about Shayna. There wasn't much to tell. She told me the same stuff. He looked at me hard, and then he got me in a headlock and called me Gregonator, his nickname for me after I accidentally set the grass next to our house on fire once. I laughed, but again was wondering if something was up. Everyone stayed into the evening, and we had a bonfire and just kept the party going. A few of us teens sneaked a few beers and talked around the fire as the adults moved into the house. And Luke also asked me more about Shayna, but stopped after a while and just said, "Damn though, man, she was hot. She looks like the woman from the When It's Love Van Halen video." And I thought about it and had to agree. Everything wrapped up after midnight, and I'm sorry for such a long backstory, but this is when things got crazy. About 1:30, I was still up, laying in bed and listening to some music, when I heard a tapping at my window. I went over to it, and it was Shayna. I pushed up the screen and half pulled her in, telling her to be quiet so as not to wake my parents. "What are you doing here?" I whispered. She just smiled and said she couldn't get me out of her mind and wanted to talk. We sat down on my bed, and I asked her why she wasn't at her grandparents', and she said she got bored because they went to bed so early. Before I knew it, we were making out, and I thought I was about to get laid by this pretty but mystery girl. So now we're laying under the sheets, and I'm a 17-year-old horn dog going for it, when I hear a bunch of noise from outside. I started to get up, and Shayna pulled me back and wrapped her legs around me after spooning me. I heard someone ring the doorbell, and my dad thumping down the hallway to see who it was, and I could hear him talking loudly with someone but not being able to make out exactly what. Shayna scrunched down and grabbed what was between my legs and held on whispering, "Don't let them find me here." Alright, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but suddenly I got a weird feeling something was up. I felt her press her other hand into my back with her knuckles, and I pushed back slightly. More footsteps came down the hallway, and my door suddenly opened. I faked like I was asleep, and I heard my dad say, "See, he's right there, asleep." And then he closed the door. I whispered to Shayna again, "What's going on? Who's looking for you?" She just stuck her tongue in my ear and told me she was going to give me something I wouldn't forget. I tried to roll over, but her grip on my Johnson was strong, so I couldn't. There was more banging and thumping and loud voices from down the hall, and I heard my uncle say, "Rick," my dad's name is Rick, "her truck is a mile up the road. She's got to be here somewhere." I heard more noise as footsteps went from room to room and into the basement, and then I heard the ladder to our roof crawl space come down. That's when we both heard a crack of a stick outside my bedroom window, and a flashlight fall on us and a voice yell out, "She's in there with Greg." Footsteps came running back to my room, and Shayna gripped me so hard I yelled out, and she said to shut up. My door flew open, and there was my uncle and two other deputies right behind him with guns drawn but pointed at the floor. My mom was screaming something awful somewhere in the background as my uncle told me to take it easy, and then told Shayna to let me get out of bed. She didn't and held me closer to her, shouting to leave us alone. There was a back and forth for a few minutes, with me trying to talk and Shayna shouting over me every time I tried to. Finally, she realized she wasn't going anywhere, and she let me go, and I rolled onto the floor looking like a complete idiot, hard on and all, still raging. It went away when I looked up at Shayna and saw that it wasn't her knuckles she was pressing into my back as she held me. It was a gun. The deputies pounced on her and got her to her feet and out through the house and into a cruiser. They took her away, and my uncle stayed around to talk to my parents and asked me a ton of questions. So Shayna was actually named something else and had no family in this state. She was on the run after nearly killing her boyfriend in a fight back in Texas where she was from, and then she stole his truck and had been running for a couple of weeks and screwed up by stopping to help me. There were no grandparents in the town she said they lived in. My uncle had checked and also drove around looking for her truck. Other deputies were doing the same after they had checked on the license plate and found out she was wanted. Other deputies were doing the same thing after everyone had checked on the license plate and found out that it was stolen and she was wanted. My uncle had driven back to our house and saw her truck abandoned on the side of the road as she was smart enough to know she was being hunted. It came out later that she planned on stealing my dad's vehicle, taking me with her and making a getaway. I know she went back to Texas and was convicted of a bunch of things and went to jail, but I'm sure she's been out for a long time now, and I don't really know the whole story. I did at one point in time, but like I said, things get fuzzy. So, yeah, that happened. An innocent country boy looking for love got caught up with a crazy girl and nearly got himself kidnapped and who knows what else. Moral of the story: if a woman seems too good to be true no matter how old you are, she probably is. Stay safe out there, everyone. The Thing in the Woods by Brian Boru. This happened to me about 15 years ago when I used to live in Park Ridge, Illinois. There was a lake not far from my house near a forest preserve called Belleau Lake, which was a popular fishing spot. There was a gravel path that ringed the lake, which is about a mile in area, and at the far end of the lake, furthest from the parking lot when you pull in off the main road, there was a forested area which went in a ways called Belleau Woods. I used to enjoy jogging around the lake in the early morning or late afternoon, just before the preserve closed. This one day it was beautiful, sunny, and fairly warm, and I'd gotten to the far end of the lake where the forest began and really needed to pee. The outhouse was by the parking lot on the opposite end, and since I didn't see anyone fishing except right by the shallower end near the parking lot, where I saw a couple of older guys, I found an opening in the woods and took the dry mud path about 20 feet in or so, and looked for a tree to do my thing. I noticed how quiet it was in the woods. No birds, no rushing of the cars from the nearby highway. I could almost hear my own breathing. I finished up and turned back onto the path when I felt a strange feeling like I wasn't alone. Although I couldn't see anyone around, it also began to feel ominous, and the hair on the back of my neck started to stand on end. I took the path around a bend where a large pine tree stood, and came around the corner to see something that was burned into my mind. About 10 or 12 feet down the path was something that looked all black, sort of shaped like an old-fashioned bedsheet ghost, touching the ground, and no features I could make out, but it swayed to the left, and then to the right, and again, like a pendulum. I guessed it to be about 6 feet tall, maybe a foot or so wide, and very black like ink. It made no sound whatsoever. After about what felt like minutes, but was probably not even a minute, I noticed that it was now closer than it originally was to me, though I don't recall seeing it move, and I know I didn't move. It had stopped swaying and was standing motionless. It took all I could to gather my wits, turn my back on it, and race down the path, hoping to find the opening in the woods I'd come in, which I did in record time. I was momentarily blinded by the sunshine outside the woods, but kept running down the path ringing the lake, not daring to look behind me until I got to the parking lot and into my car. Only then did I look to see if it had followed me, but of course, I didn't see anything. I had no clue what I had just seen, but I was shaking still and had to calm down a few minutes before I could drive. I did go back to Lake Belleau after that to have a jog a couple of more times, but never again dared to go back into those woods after that experience. This is my Stalker Story by Ringo B82. My freshman year of college was one of the funnest years of my life, and some of my fondest memories are from that year. But it was also the scariest and strangest year to date. This is thanks to one story in particular. There are actually a couple more that I might post some other time, and this took place over the entire school year. I still sometimes wonder how this really happened, and I didn't end up a shut-in nutjob. It still freaks me out to this day. August 2001. Like most freshmen, I lived in the dorms at a state party school. I opted out of the good school I got into, and I guess I had a little steam to blow off after graduating from a military college prep boarding school. Plus, after a sports injury, I didn't exactly have any specific plan for life that went past Saturday night, if you know what I mean. A good buddy from military school, Bill, went to the same college and lived a few floors below me in the same dorm. So of course, we were getting the party started before my parents' exhaust fumes had even evaporated from the parking lot. For the most part, the first month or so of college was pretty much like that. Normal. I went to most of my classes, partied just about every night, chased girls around, and that was enough for the moment. But things began to change one night, sometime in mid-September, and college for me would never be normal again. My dorm phone, a landline, only Zach Morris carried a cell phone in 2001, get over it, it rang in the middle of the night. Hello? On the other end, I could only really describe the voice as the kind you picture when you think about a computer talking. Kind of like the early model car GPSs.
Hi, Gary. How are you today?
Not fully awake, I was just confused at that point. Who is this? He repeated.
Hi, Gary. How are you today?
It became clear I'm being fucked with, so I hung up and chuckled. Fucking Bill, nice one. And I passed back out. I ended up forgetting about the call for a few days and never mentioned it to Bill or anyone else. About a week later, I get another call around the same time of night.
Hi, Gary. I'm watching you.
Nice. Very cliche. Seriously, Bill, how are you not knee-deep in Everclear or a Tri-Delt at this hour? Enough already. Cade, my roommate, is starting to get pissed. And then I hung up. I casually confronted my oh-so-clever amigo at breakfast the next morning, purposely not trying to bite too hard to give him a payoff that might have incentivized to continue the calls. I also wasn't 100% it was actually him and not another one of my douchebag friends. He gave a genuinely confused response. Whatever. So a couple days after the second call, I came home and saw I had multiple messages on my answering machine. What the fuck? I barely knew the thing even worked. It's computer-voiced guy again, and I'll call him CVG from here on out. Message 1. My machine cuts off the first 1 or 2 seconds of the message, which tells me it's a bot set to play message upon answer.
Hello, no one is available to take your call. Please leave a message after the tone.
Hi, Gary. I'm watching you.
Message 2.
I thought I asked you to answer my calls, Gary.
Message 3.
Where might Gary be on a Tuesday night?
Okay, so one of my friends is clearly an asshole, or bored enough to really push for a reaction here. The next day, I play the messages for Cade, who was around during the calls, which were apparently earlier in the night when he was still awake. He'd been a close buddy since we were in junior high, but we'd sort of taken separate paths after high school. So anyway, he's aware I'm a wild child and thinks nothing of the first couple of messages. By the third, he's a little spooked. I then walk down to a couple of other buddies' rooms and casually but immediately bring up the subject. Nada. Over the next couple of days, I pressed all close and semi-close friends, but got 0 answers and 0 suspects. The calls started coming more frequently over the next couple months, starting at once a week, then to once every 2 or 3 days, up to every day by Christmas break. I don't say anything to my family at that point, although I really should have. What started out as a decent beginning of college turned into not showing up for any classes, tests, or anything. Grades reflected, and I'm too busy answering for a .67 GPA to talk about some dumb prank that would likely be dismissed as a pathetic attempt at grades explanation. So it goes. I had an uneventful break and went back to school determined to become a new man. I gotta get my shit together with these grades, so I tell Bill I'm gonna have to chill out and focus on school. First night back, I get my first spring semester call from CVG.
How is your family in Cyprus?
That's my hometown. Okay, now this is fucking bullshit, man. What kind of douche lords am I hanging out with that even have the discipline to drag out a prank this long? I get the answer to that question a few days later, and the answer is none of them. Calls become threatening and downright dark.
I'm very interested, Gary, in being close to you.
Yeah, with that kind of weird sentence structure like that.
I have tools I can bring. It is going to be all over soon.
One day, I bring Bill and all my other buddies up to hear the messages. I never deleted a single one for some reason. I guess when things happen over longer periods of time, you don't really feel the cumulative impact until laying out the complete package of evidence. The guys were in shock. I guess I should mention that some of these calls got really specific in making sure to note specific details about my parents' address, as well as the violence they were planning on doing to me.
Cut open your esophagus, Gary, with a butter knife.
And all sorts of other crap that is sort of blurred together through the hundreds upon hundreds of calls I got over the school year. A chick friend of mine that I really liked in high school named Layla went to a different school hundreds of miles away. And we've reconnected thanks to good old AIM and talked from time to time on the phone. CVG had mentioned a couple of times your friend and made threats about this unspecified person from time to time, but your friend turned into your friend Layla. Layla and I are the only two people ever named in these calls, but it did get me wondering if this was a new lead to this source. Layla is clueless when I called her about it. Awesome. I know that background was long to read, but you'll understand why I had to explain the situation when I tell you about what happens next. One night, we're all partying and drinking at some hotel. Forgot to mention all that straight A crap went out the window as these events progressed. A different buddy, Carl, has a nice big truck we'd all go everywhere in, but he passed out drunk at the hotel after pounding an entire bottle of whatever the fuck. I'm not really drinking tonight and want to get back to my own bed. I snatch Carl's keys to drive back to campus, thinking I'll drive back in the morning to get everyone. This was one of the few times I'd ever driven that year, so I wasn't tip-top on my directions. I made an early turn and somehow was down a road I'd never seen. I realized this pretty quick, but I figure I've got the general direction of campus pegged, so I can just continue the wrong road until hitting the familiar highway that I knew I'd eventually have to hit that was close to campus. I'm finding myself in open fields. Still a paved road and everything, but aside from the road there was absolutely nothing, and it was completely black. Around 3 a.m., and there's this really strange four-way stop I come upon. Strange because I'm probably the fourth person in a year to drive on that road. Anyway, I trudge along, eventually getting to the familiar highway and home free. A few days later, CVG interrupts his usual depraved threatening to mention that specific four-way, day, and time I was on it, which, like I said, was around 3 a.m., and there wasn't a soul in sight. So, yeah, I now realize CVG is obviously tracking my movements somehow. Note, I later joined the military, worked in the intelligence community, and worked special operations and tracked bad guys all around the world. To this day, I still can't figure out how this dude knew I was in the middle of those fields on that date in the middle of the night. I never mentioned it to anyone. Around March, this apparent rendezvous became CVG's focal point, and he'd made sure to let me know the day was close. The calls were coming in no fewer than 10 or 15 every single day. Seriously. The ringer was now off out of courtesy to Cade, and I turned down the volume of the answering machine as his phone calls recorded. But I finally get the message I had been waiting for. Keep in mind, I have now become somewhat famous or infamous at this university because of CVG. People were constantly knocking on my door wanting to hear the messages. Friend of whomever, I know. It was all people wanted to hear about at parties. Blah, blah, blah. For a split second, it was cool because I'm pretty sure I ended up getting a few dates indirectly from introductions conceived through interest in the guy with the stalker. Hey, don't judge me. Moving right along, day, time, location are set.
We will meet in front of Coleman Hall at midnight Wednesday, 27 April. And we will take our friendship to the next level.
I know what you're thinking, and yeah, throughout the year I had considered the possibility that I was dealing with a female. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, and I was definitely that kind of dude when I was 18 or 19 years old. The kind that could attract clinginess and anger. But I started to rule out females for various reasons that only a fellow ENFJ would understand. And look it up if you're not tracking. I can build profiles with a very high ratio of accuracy to available information. This creep just didn't feel like a female to me. It didn't even feel like a peer. I was convinced I was dealing with mid-30s white male computer nerd that I'd come into contact with at some point in my life. Doesn't really matter, because what I ended up finding out on the 27th of April, which was a Wednesday and also Layla's birthday, I was wrong. Of course, everyone wants to be part of this juicy story, and there's a pretty ridiculous amount of testosterone floating around the dorm on game day. This was a real-life creepster and a legit horror story unfolding before their very eyes, and groupthink will subvert caution if properly motivated. These guys are ready to defend me with their lives. Just ask them. So while these monkeys are getting all hopped up on Mountain Dew, I stayed home that afternoon wondering what the fuck I was going to do at midnight. Of course I was going to go, but... Dude, yeah, I've been an athlete in good shape and wrestling, football, and baseball teams, yada yada yada. But I'm still a 19-year-old white male, good parents, grew up in upper white middle class suburbia, had a good life. In other words, I can definitely hold my own in a street fight, but this, whatever this is, doesn't feel like anything like a street fight, or any other kind of fight I'd ever been in. This is a disturbed, violent, angry, and possibly grown-ass psychopath that has decided to dedicate almost a full year now of his life to targeting and terrorizing me. So yeah, I was a little friggin' nervous. My home team crowd steadily built up throughout the afternoon and evening, with probably close to 70 or 80 guys grouped up at our dorm's common area. We were connected to the female dorm at the first floor. They were smoking cigarettes and talking about beating the shit out of people and getting fucked up and all the other generic cliche shit you can imagine. Once the party hour approaches, though, over half the guys splinter off into other various propositions that probably included more traditional fun, like beer bongs and sorority girls. I was left with about 15 or 20 guys. I decided earlier that I was not going to allow all these knuckleheads to shadow me, but I could definitely use them in case of emergency. I didn't want to risk this guy spooking out of the meet, so I let them all know they would need to stay inside the doors of the common area while I walked out to the meeting spot. Coleman Hall was adjacent to our connected girls' dorm, and about 300 paces outside door to door to get to Coleman. The hour came, so I left the crew to begin the longest couple hundred or so paces of my life. My boys can see me through the glass doors, but wouldn't really be able to see much once I got to the Coleman Hall door. About 100 paces out from my spot, I observed two things at the same time. One, some kind of small, quick movement in front of the patio walkway that goes all the way around the building. And two, the movement was in a spot along the walkway, where the only normally uber-bright bulb was out. I'm not exactly sure how I was able to see him, but I suddenly realized someone was crouched behind one of the continuous cookie-cutter bushes outside the patio perimeter against one of the building pillars. In dark clothes and hoodie, he was a few feet off from the path where I was supposed to meet him, and positioned to where I really should not have been able to see him, given the pillar blocking any shadows plus the burnt-out, which I later found out was smashed, light. In fact, I could have easily walked all the way to the door without ever having noticed someone down there. Nope. I sort of jump mid-steps as this happens, and I see him raise up a little, thinking I might have seen him. I saw him raise up and take a step towards me, and fight or flight hit. I've learned that my particular flight or fight chooses fight in more mild situations, flight during intense situations, but for shit-your-pants situations, it's scarier to run away with your back to whatever scary shit I was dealing with. So I decided to fight. Before I realized what I was doing, I was in a dead sprint towards this motherfucker who I'm guessing sees what I can't yet, which is my platoon busting through the glass doors in hot pursuit. Creepster nopes the fuck out of there, running onto the patio alongside Coleman Hall towards the parking lot. I can tell this isn't a mid-30s computer nerd I predicted. Creepster is above average height, above average broad, and built athletically. That's all I could tell, really. I'm not even sure if he was white because he was at least tan, if not Hispanic or Middle Eastern. I was really booking it as he turned on a dime right at the edge of the building. I realized I was moving fast enough to catch him, but everyone else is really far behind. I also realize I'm moving so fast I won't be protected as I turn hard right at the corner of the building. If he stopped there, I'm toast. As I turned the corner, I saw a van sitting alone in the parking lot in front of me. It was running and brake lights flickered on then off. Park and to drive. It began inching forward towards the exit. Home Slice is of course heading for the van, which for some reason sent this whole new level of fear into me. This is it. This is really happening, and I'm going to get fucking murdered tonight. But I can't stop. Something keeps me moving forward. I guess I'd come this far, dealt with this crazy bullshit for almost a full year now, completely unable to do anything other than try to ignore it. I'm not exactly going places academically at this point, and my life doesn't quite have all that much purpose to it yet. If I'm going to get schwacked, I will at least know, and this crap will at least be over. Plus, I still have a chance to catch this madman before he gets away. If I could get close enough to dive tackle, I'd still be on my own to deal with the creepster, his driver, and now I realize there's a third one that was manning the sliding side door. Awesome. I don't care how badass you think you are when you're a 19-year-old jock. Your chances of taking down 3 grown men that are probably violent criminals and prepared to victimize me are about 1 and not gonna fucking happen, buddy. My turn was wide and slow due to being full-on sprinting, and I lost ground. I'm probably 20 yards from the lot when he does a flying leap into the side of the van, and there couldn't have been any rows or seats for a leap like that. Creepster number 3 slammed the sliding door shut as the van peeled out of the parking lot, banged a right, and was gone in an instant. The relief of not being kidnapped and bound and gagged in that van with 3 psychos who most likely had some pretty horrific plans for me was now just as strong as the dread of the fact that this is still not over with. I was speechless, and so was my platoon as they caught up to me a minute later. A few of them caught up enough to witness the parking lot scene, but no one was talking. Testosterone had now been replaced with genuine and earnest concern. They all just stood there with me, catching their breath and making sure I was okay. One guy asked if I got a plate number, and I didn't. There wasn't enough light. We finally started walking back, and I'm reliving the scene as we retraced our steps. As we got closer to the original meeting spot, I saw something that scared me more than anything else in the entire equation up to this point. On the opposite side of the pillar where Creepy McCreeperson was crouching, there was a video camera sitting on a stand pointed right at the spot I would have been standing at when I should have not been able to notice him. It was still recording. My Scary House, submitted by Scuttlebutt61. Growing up, I became familiar with the paranormal pretty fast. I can't say anything about what happened before I was 6 or 7 and started to notice things were strange around my house, but I'm sure I noticed a lot of things before that. I grew up in a village in Georgia with my parents, my older brother, and my little sister. When I was 6, my brother, let's call him R, was 9 and my sister A was 4. My dad had a good business job but was away on work a lot. He was a successful salesman. My mom was a stay-at-home mom at this time, but took a job a few years into my story when A was at school full-time. Our house was a big old mansion with 5 bedrooms, sitting rooms, a library, and even servants' quarters that we used as an office for my dad and kind of a play space for us. We had a home gym out there, and that's where we had our Super Nintendo and Sega and stuff like that. I think that's the place where I started to notice something was strange at our house. And my brother might have seen things more than he let on, but we didn't know at the time. He told me later. When I was 6, my brother and I were playing in the back house. Just video games and listening to music and probably fighting. That's when we both heard a noise from a room that we used as storage. It came off the room we were in. It sounded like a knocking sound, and R got up and switched off the stereo and told me to pause the game. We sat quietly, and then the knocking came again. It was definitely coming from the closet. R got up and opened the door and pulled the string for the overhead light, and there was nothing in there but boxes and stuff like that. He said out loud, "Maybe it's mice or something," and moved some things around. He came back and shrugged and said there could be something in the walls, or maybe it was our dad doing something. We went back to playing the game with the stereo off, and after a little while, the knocking came again. But this time it was much louder. It was more of a pounding. Our dad, who was home at that time and in the gym, came over and asked us what we were doing. We said we thought it was him making the noise, and that's when we heard the knocking again, and then scratching in the walls. "Might be a squirrel trapped in the wall," said Dad, and walked over to a wall where it sounded like the scratching was coming from. He tapped on the wall and nothing happened. He tapped harder and another scratch came, but this wasn't like the sound of animal feet running. It was a scratch that started at the ceiling and came down to the floor in one long sound. Dad cocked his head. R said maybe it was a ghost, and I said to shut up. I was getting scared. I was just a little kid. Dad went around outside and then up onto the roof looking for anything that could be making the noise, but even while he was out there, we could hear the knocking on the inside. It was still in the closet, but the scratching was in the walls out by us. When he came back in, Dad looked at both of us and said sternly, "Are you playing a joke on me?" He was serious and had his "I'm not messing around" look on his face. We both shook our heads and the knocking came again. We all stood there looking at each other, and then a massive boom rang out, and we jumped, it was so loud. "All right, everyone out," said Dad, and we headed out the door into the yard. I forgot to turn our game off and ran back in to do it despite my dad yelling at me to come back. I turned the system off and turned around, and I swear I heard a low rumble, or maybe it was more like a low breathing. I ran back out and told Dad, and he said to get up to the house. He called his best friend, who was a police officer in our village, and B came over to check out the place with Dad to see what was going on. They searched all around the outbuilding, inside and out, top to bottom, but there was nothing, and no holes for animals to get in or anything like that. We were stumped. R and I wandered back out and went over to stand near Uncle B and Dad. We called all of my dad's friends Uncle, and they were talking about what could be making the noise. Uncle B said that it was probably just an animal trapped in there, and to call the local pest guy. It was just turning to dusk, and that's when the lights went on in every room of the outbuilding. We all looked wide-eyed at it, and B walked back inside. He called for my dad, and he went in, and they were both in there for quite a while. And R and I talked about what was happening and kept saying that it was a ghost. Suddenly, they both came running out with Dad slamming the door behind him. They were both white as sheets, and I'll never forget that. "Get on back to the house," said Dad to us, and we all went up to it. I turned around when we got to the back porch and said, "Dad, the lights are off." The rest of them turned around, and sure enough, the lights in the outbuilding were now off. We went inside while Dad and Uncle B stood talking. Mom was finishing dinner, and we were telling her what was going on, and she just smiled and said we were being crazy with imagination. No matter how much we told her, Dad saw and heard the stuff too. She told us to just wash up for dinner and quit playing at ghosts, but stopped mid-sentence staring out the back window. R and I looked out there, and the lights in the building were flicking on and off real fast. Uncle B and Dad stood looking at it, and then Dad came inside and went down to our basement where the breakers were. He flicked the power off to the outbuilding, and everything stopped. When he came up, Mom asked him what was going on, and he said he thought there was some electrical problems causing some strange things to happen. Uncle B left and we had dinner, me and R wanting to talk about things, but my dad told us to stop it and let it go. He would take care of it. He told us to stay out of there until he figured out what was going on. Nothing else happened for a couple of years, and it only remained in our conversations and a way to scare our friends who came over to visit. We would tell them all kinds of crazy stories about what was out there. But then, out of the blue, things started up again. It started with the lights, but the sounds came back, and this time they didn't stay out in the outbuilding. Things were happening at the house. R was 13 now, and one night had some friends staying over on a weekend. They were fooling around and not letting me join them, and I was being the bratty brother trying to get them to let me into R's room. That's when one of R's friends started screaming that someone was in the window looking at them. He said he saw a dark shape with sort of a face pressing up against the glass. But it couldn't have been a person. I mean, this was on the second floor, and there was no roof out there. The kid got so scared he wanted to go home, and his mom came out and got him. R told my parents what he had seen, and my mom looked at my dad but didn't say anything. I asked my brother if I could sleep with him and his two other buddies because I was scared again, and he said sure. Later that night, as the guys were all talking, my sister was asking my parents why there was yelling and screaming earlier, and they were comforting her, telling her we were just fooling around. I heard all of this because I went for a glass of water. And then I heard my mom say something like, "See, I knew something was happening. It sounded just like the thing I saw when you were at the movies last week." She was talking to my dad, not me. Dad was quiet, and then said there had to be an explanation for what was happening. But that night it got worse. In the middle of the night, A started screaming about a black thing in her room, and all us guys heard my parents go into her room and calm her down, but she wouldn't. She finally went into their room, and the rest of the night was quiet. Again, things died down for a couple of years, but they came back when I was 14 and R was getting ready to leave for the Marines. We were sitting outside on our porch just talking about baseball and chicks and his excitement to serve in the military. We were looking at the outbuilding. "You know, I never told you this, but I used to see things out there," he said. "Really?" I asked. "Like what?" He then went into this story about how when I was really little, he would go out into the yard and see shapes of people in the building looking out at him, and there was this one black shape that always put its hands up onto the windows. He was about 6 at the time, and wasn't scared, but he knew he should be. He told me he had told Mom, but she said he was just fussing and probably angry he wasn't the only child anymore. And that's when I went in there one day before Dad had fixed it up for us. It was dirty and dark, and when I went in, I heard knocking and scratching, just like we did together. Remember that? I said, yeah, and he told me that's when he went in. The door shut behind him, and the noises got really loud, so he ran out, and he never told anybody about it. Like something out of a movie, the lights came on in the outbuilding, but no one else was home but us. R looked at me and said, "I'm not scared of the military, but I'm scared of that." The lights started flicking on and off again, and then the lights in the house started up too. Being older and not as scared as kids, but still scared, we ran into the house and the front and back doors started opening and shutting on their own, over and over, and that breathing I heard when I was little was in the house, and it was really loud. R kept trying to turn the lamps and overhead lights off, but they just kept flicking on and off, and we heard heavy footsteps moving around upstairs. They seemed to be racing up and down the hallway and in and out of every room, and I said we should get out of there. The steps started coming down the stairs. So we ran out the front door, and R held it from shutting, and we launched out into the front porch. The door slammed behind us, and just then my parents were pulling up with my sister from a Girl Scout meeting or whatever. Mom had a look of horror on her face, and Dad jumped out asking what the hell was going on. A started crying, and my mom said to my dad, "Look!" and pointed at the front living room window. There was the black shape everyone had seen except me. But there it was. No shit. Dad told everyone to get in the truck, and we pulled away from the house. He stopped at Uncle B's house and told him what was going on, and he said he'd go over and take a look, and Mom wanted to talk to our preacher. We were Baptist, but hadn't been going to church that much, so I wondered why she wanted to see him. Mom called him. Uncle B got back and said nothing was wrong at the house, other than the back door being left open by 2 ghosts he said he thought looked like me and my brother. But when we protested, he just said there was nothing out there. Mom told Dad our preacher was going to meet us back at our house, and while we didn't want to go and protested, except for my brother, we went back. He was a nice man and listened to all of us telling him what we had experienced over the years. He just sat there smiling, drinking coffee, and listened politely, and finally told us that we needed to pray and come back to church. He wanted to bless the house and walked around with my parents saying prayers and stuff and told us to call if we needed him. Nice, but it felt like he was just going through the motions. Everything was quiet again for a bit, but one night we all woke up to screaming coming from downstairs and the footsteps racing around. A was sleeping in my room now, and she jumped on me really scared as we listened to my dad yelling at it to go away and saying the Our Father prayer. The next morning, Mom had it. She wanted to leave for a while, and Dad wanted more answers other than prayers. This was around 2002, so the ghost hunter craze was in full glory, and Dad printed out tons of information from groups that claimed to be Ghostbusters. I remember reading some of it and thinking some of these people looked a few bricks shy of a load, and actually laughing at the prospect of some clowns coming into our house, thinking they'd see a chair slide around or something, and maybe hear some voices through a bunch of static. I mean, that was all that was on their websites. Dad took a chance with one group and said they were free and wanted to help, but when they got to our place, they wanted to be alone in the house, and Dad said, yeah, right, and sent them packing. He wasn't just going to let strangers wander around and probably steal stuff. Another group came out to talk to my parents first, and then wanted to do an overnight investigation with cameras and recorders, all the stuff you see on the TV shows. They did, and while we didn't notice anything, they shared some EVPs with us the next day, but I honestly didn't hear anything. R was leaving for BT, and I was sad to see him go. Things were quiet again, but when he came home right after he finished BT, the same crazy stuff happened again. But now there was this really eerie sound coming from the outbuilding, and the light show out there was so fantastic, Dad broke down and called the power company and the fire company, convinced that something physical was making all of this happen. Mom grabbed my sister and told me to come with her, and that they were going to my grandparents' house an hour away, and I wanted to stay. Dad said to go with them, but I said no. It was the first time I had ever said no to him, and he got really pissed. That's when R said he'd met a guy at camp that had something similar happen to him at his house growing up. He had told him about this Skeptic group that came out and found out all these rational explanations for everything, and it all stopped or went away with some simple fixes to wells, drafty windows, and stuff like that. I thought this was a little beyond that stuff, and so did Dad, but after Mom just left, he said he'd look into it. Mom and Dad fought all that night on the phone, and the noises started up again in the house. We couldn't sleep, and by now R and I were trying to record everything, but when we played tapes back, nothing was there. The next day, Dad looked the group up on the internet and called the people. They were from a state over, but not super far away. They were interested in what was going on and said they would visit us if we would have them. And Mom was still calling Dad, telling him we needed to just sell and get out of the house. She wasn't coming back, but he convinced her that these people might be able to help. 4 people came out that next weekend and spent the next 2 days in and around our house, both during the night and the day. They took tons of pictures, videos, recordings. They measured all kinds of distances, wanted to see any surveys of the land we had, and on and on. One of them did nothing but research our village, looking for property deeds, underground streams, where the airplanes flew over, you name it. It was nothing like the other group. Someone was always at our place, too. I think to make sure we weren't trying to trick them. They asked all of us tons of questions, alone and together, looking for something. Maybe to see if we were lying, I don't know. While they were there, nothing happened. On Sunday evening, though, they sat down with my dad at our dining room table and went over all the stuff that they had found, which was basically nothing. There was nothing out of the ordinary about the land, the house, the surrounding area. There wasn't even any folklore in the area to speak of. My dad just nodded while they talked, and that's when the footsteps started racing upstairs. 2 of the investigators ran up there while the footsteps charged around, and we could hear the guys yelling to the people downstairs to get some kind of equipment or whatever, and then we could hear the bedroom doors opening and slamming shut. The breathing sound was back, but only upstairs, and the other people rushed up there, and R and I made a move to go up, but Dad shook his head no. Suddenly, there was a ton of screaming, and it wasn't just the stuff we had heard in the past. It was the investigators yelling and shouting at each other. One guy started screaming, "Get it off me! Get it off me!" And we heard the crazy footsteps come flying down the stairs and by us out the back door. We all felt the breeze as it went by, whatever it was. Everything was silent upstairs now, but the lights in the outbuilding were going crazy and the door to it was opening and closing. And then it just stopped. Dad went upstairs and we could hear voices talking for a long time before they all came down. The people gathered up their stuff and said they'd put together a report and call my dad in a day or two. That never happened. We never heard from them again, and my dad called and emailed, but they never answered and they never wrote back. We never saw a report of any kind. R went back to the service, Mom came home, and Dad finally said we were selling the place, and we did. Nothing happened while we waited for a buyer, and nothing's happened to any of us since we moved out. And this was a long time ago, and I've got my own family now, and nothing's happened to them or me. We all still talk about it when we get together, but I think we all just put it out of our minds for the most part. So, that's my story, long but true. This took me a long time to write down over a bunch of days, and I keep remembering other things, but none of it is that big, so I'm sending this as is. There wasn't any exorcism or bleeding walls or any of that kind of thing, but that was one messed up place, that's for sure. Now that I've written this, I wonder if the people who bought it saw anything, or anyone else after that had ever lived there maybe saw something too. I can't say, and I guess it doesn't really matter. We lived through it, and that's enough for me. Seeing Things Others Can't. Submitted by Helen W. When there's a death in my family, strange things happen, at least to me. I adored my mum. She was a good egg, as I would say, and we were very close. I knew she had cancer, and I knew she was dying, so I told her it was only a matter of time. Anyway, her first chemo session left her in renal failure, and she was admitted to the hospital. Myself and my daughter were in the car traveling down, and the journey would take us about 3 hours. I smoked at the time and rolled the window down to have a cigarette. As I did this, I noticed a pink haze in the back of the car. As it grew, I felt a complete peace come over me, and the atmosphere in the car was loving and peaceful. The haze turned into the most beautiful pink being with wings. As the window was opened slightly, her wings rustled. My daughter, who was 15 at the time, turned to me and said, "Mom, there's something in the back of the car. A pink something." I said to her without thinking, "That's an angel, and Mom has died. She's just helping us get to the hospital." She stayed with us for the whole journey, and the peace was really amazing. As we walked into the hospital, where we were met by my father, a brother, and the vicar, my daughter said to them, "Oh, it's okay. We know Nana is dead. The angel told Mum." They stopped in their tracks, totally stunned. I went in to see my mom laying in the bed in a single room, and without thinking, I went up to her and took a hold of her hair and cut a fringe off and placed it in my purse. I heard her tell me off and then start laughing, and then the room was full of laughter. As I did this, my brother walked in and turned to me in turmoil and said, "You've only been here a few minutes alone with Mum, and the room was cold and horrid before, but it's lighter and loving now." He was so upset with me, he turned again and said, "Why can't I feel or see what you can?" It was really strange how he reacted, but it also confirmed to me that the energy was real, and it was amazing. Another strange happening was in a train to Reading. My 2 girls and I had taken a trip to see my brother and his wife, and we were heading home. We sat in a standard train car with table and chairs. As we sat down, I noticed on the other side of the car, a glowing tall man was standing there, dressed in a white gown. He was smiling, and I was scared. "Why are you here?" I said with a worried voice. "Are we going to die on this train?" He said to me softly, "No, I'm waiting." We left the train at Reading, and I felt a mixture of relief and worry about the man. The next day, the train was involved in a massive crash as it headed to London. I feel he was waiting for those people and not us. These are totally true stories, and they don't often happen. But when they do, they totally change you. Hey gang, I hope you enjoyed this volume of Uncle Josh's True Scary Stories. I'm still looking for creepy and scary gym and workout tales, so if you've got one and any other scary story, send it to unclejoshtruescarystories@gmail.com. Please like, share, and subscribe to this channel and check out my other videos, and leave a comment below. I love the conversations that we get going down there. Follow me on social media, all of the links are in the description below, and if you feel so inclined, throw me a tip at my Patreon page. A link for that is also in the description. Thanks again for listening. A live virtual campfire coming up soon, so look forward to that. I know I am. Till next time, everybody, be excellent to each other. And remember, be wary of things that go bump in the night. It could be anything. A ghost, a monster, or the guy next door.